The Boston Tea Party, one of the defining events in American history, took place on December 16, 1773, in Boston, Massachusetts. It was a bold act of protest against British taxation without representation, and it played a pivotal role in the lead-up to the American Revolution. The event involved a group of American colonists, frustrated with British policies, disguising themselves as Native Americans and boarding British ships to dump 342 chests of tea into the Boston harbor. This act of defiance sent shockwaves through the British government and set the stage for further tensions between the American colonies and the British Crown. To fully understand the significance of the Boston Tea Party, it's essential to examine the context in which it occurred. In the years leading up to the event, the relationship between the American colonies and Britain had been deteriorating due to a series of unpopular policies imposed by the British government. The British Parliament, seeking to generate revenue to pay off debts from the French and Indian War, passed a series of taxes on the American colonies. The Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765 were met with strong resistance from the colonists, who believed that they should not be taxed without representation in the British Parliament. Protests against the Stamp Act were particularly fierce, with colonists forming organizations such as the Sons of Liberty to resist British policies. The Stamp Act Congress, held in October 1765, brought together representatives from 9 colonies to draft a petition to the King and Parliament, asserting the colonists' rights as British subjects. In response to the colonists' opposition, the British Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766 but simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, which asserted its right to tax and legislate over the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. Despite the repeal of the Stamp Act, tensions continued to rise, and the British government continued to levy taxes on the colonies. One such tax was the Townshend Acts of 1767, which imposed duties on various goods imported into the colonies, including tea. The revenue collected from these duties was used to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges, thus making them independent of the colonial legislatures and further limiting the colonists' control over their government. In response to the Townshend Acts, colonists once again organized boycotts and protests, refusing to import British goods in an effort to exert economic pressure on Britain. The British government, attempting to assert its authority, dispatched British troops to enforce order in the colonies, further inflaming tensions between the colonists and the Crown. The situation in Boston was particularly tense. British troops were stationed in the city, and clashes between the soldiers and the locals were not uncommon. One of the flashpoints was the presence of British tea ships in Boston Harbor. Several merchants held consignments of tea from the British East India Company, and they were subject to the unpopular tea tax. In September 1773, the Tea Act was passed by the British Parliament, which granted the British East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade with the American colonies. This allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies without having to pay the regular duties that colonial merchants had to pay. However, the Tea Act also required that the colonial merchants pay a duty on the tea when it arrived in the colonies. This act was seen by many colonists as an attempt by the British government to control the colonial tea trade and further assert its authority. The colonists viewed the Tea Act as a violation of their rights and an extension of British taxation without representation. In November 1773, the first of the tea ships, the Dartmouth, arrived in Boston Harbor. Protests erupted in the city, with large crowds gathering at public meetings to discuss the situation. Samuel Adams and other prominent members of the Sons of Liberty urged the colonial authorities to refuse to allow the tea to be unloaded and to send the ships back to Britain. On December 16, 1773, a mass meeting was held at the Old South Meeting House in Boston to discuss the fate of the tea. British authorities refused to allow the tea ships to leave without paying the duties, and Governor Thomas Hutchinson declined to let the ships depart without unloading their cargo. As the meeting continued, a group of colonists, led by Samuel Adams and dressed as Mohawk Indians to conceal their identities, made their way to the harbor. They boarded the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, and proceeded to destroy the tea by throwing the 342 chests overboard. This act of defiance became known as the Boston Tea Party. The British government, upon learning of the destruction of the tea, was outraged and sought to punish the American colonies. In response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed a series of punitive measures known as the Coercive Acts, or Intolerable Acts, in 1774. These acts closed the port of Boston, altered the Massachusetts colonial charter, and allowed British officials to be tried in England rather than in the colonies. The coercive acts were intended to suppress further dissent and bring the colonies back into submission. However, instead of quelling the unrest, these measures had the opposite effect. The acts united the colonies against British oppression and sparked widespread support for the cause of American independence. In September 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, with delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia being the exception, coming together to discuss a unified response to British policies. The Congress denounced the Intolerable Acts and issued a series of resolutions affirming the rights of the colonists and calling for a boycott of British goods. The Boston Tea Party was a pivotal event that not only escalated tensions between the American colonies and the British government but also solidified the resolve of the colonists to resist British oppression and fight for their rights and liberties. It galvanized the American colonists and provided a catalyst for the larger movement towards independence. The Boston Tea Party remains a symbol of American resistance and a testament to the power of collective action in the pursuit of freedom and self-determination. It is commemorated as a significant moment in American history and serves as a reminder of the importance of preserving and defending democratic principles. In conclusion, the Boston Tea Party was a transformative event in the lead-up to the American Revolution. It was an act of protest against British taxation without representation and a powerful display of American resistance to British policies. The destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor served as a rallying cry for American independence and united the colonies in their fight against British oppression. The legacy of the Boston Tea Party lives on, reminding us of the importance of standing up for our rights and liberties and the enduring impact of collective action in shaping the course of history.